Hello, amazing psychology students, and welcome to Lecture 1 for Chapter 1. This lecture will be covering Chapter 1, pages 5 through 20 of your guys' textbook. So please make sure that you read those as well. So I put the learning objectives up for you guys today. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to explain what it means to reason empirically. Appreciate how psychological research methods help you become a better producer of information as well as a better consumer of information. And then describe 5 habits that define the work of scientists. So a little bit more into depth, more detailed learning. You're going to be able to articulate how the roles of consumers and producers of psychological research are similar and how they are different. You're going to be able to explain how theories and data interact to form empirical inquiry. You're going to be able to identify examples of basic and applied research and then describe the interactions between the two kinds of research. You're going to be able to describe the role of the peer review process in science, which we're going to cover. You're going to be able to find the norms of science by Merton and explain how they help science be more creditable and self-correcting. I've included a slide that goes over each of those for you guys to visually take a look at. And then describe the differences between empirical journals and popular journalism. So let's go ahead and get into the meat of what we're doing. Psychologists are empiricists. Okay, so psychology science is based on research done by psychologists. What is an empiricist? Empiricists base their conclusions on systematic, unbiased observations of the world. So they observe everything, they take in everything, and then they make their conclusions systematically by using the scientific method. They have conducted studies on people and animals acting in their natural environments or in specifically designated situations. Okay. So why then are producers and the role of them so important? So when psychology students are fascinated by the research process, they can become producers of research. So produce as in make, right? So the producer role is important in psychology. It's important in many ways. It's important for your coursework because it helps you to develop skills. You have to use the scientific method. So if you've ever had biology class before, you may know what the scientific method is. We're going to take a look at that later on within the lecture. For graduate school, you may know all about research methods to be able to write a paper. Got to write a research paper, you got to produce the paper. Maybe for working in a research lab, you got to know how to organize, measure, interpret the data collected, document, observe, and analyze behavior of people and animals. So then why is the consumer role important? So we looked at producer. Now we're going to look at consumer. For your guys' test, you need to know the difference between the two, okay? Becoming a savvy consumer of information is important as you learn to develop and read about research, the ability to read about research with curiosity and a critical eye. So as a producer, you're producing the research. As the consumer, you're taking in the research, right? So for psychology courses, when you're reading printed or online news stories based on research, you learn to ask the appropriate questions so you can evaluate info correctly. For your future career, you'll be able to read research to know, for example, which therapies are most effective, right? So evidence-based treatment equals therapies that are supported by research. So if we're going to do post-traumatic stress, for example, a therapy model that is evidence-based treatment would be MDR. Okay. All right. So what are the benefits then of being a good consumer? So what do you gain by being a critical consumer of information? It means that you don't just accept claims at face value, that you're using scientific thinking and evidence-based reasoning to come up with your conclusions. So it's the ability to separate fact from opinion. It's better decision-making skills. It's protection against misinformation. So because you're not just accepting claims at face value, you're able to spot red flags in research. Certain things like lack of peer review, maybe small sample sizes, or overgeneralized conclusions. So it helps you avoid sharing or believing fake news, pseudoscience, or exaggerated claims. 4, it helps improved understanding of scientific research. So you learn to evaluate the research design, methodology, and statistical analysis, because sometimes statistics, how they're presented, may not be what exactly it's saying, and you may take it one way, okay, rather than what's presented. So it's important to be able to look at and evaluate that. It helps you understand how conclusions are reached, not what those conclusions are. It gives you stronger communication and persuasion skills and lifelong learning and adaptability. So those are the benefits of being a good consumer. So in your guys' book, there's a section that talks about the Scared Straight program. So maybe you guys have seen it on A&E. It's a series that used to be on. So the Scared Straight program was designed to detour at-risk youth from crime by taking them to prisons and exposing them to harsh realities through direct interactions with inmates. It feels like it should work, right? The emotional impact is strong and the logic seems intuitive, right? So what happened was early testimonials and media coverage praised the program, showing individual stories of kids who turned their lives around, right? But however, controlled research studies later showed that participants in Scared Straight were actually more likely to commit crimes compared to similar youth who didn't attend. So that's a big one, right? They're more likely to commit crimes after going to the Scared Straight program. So what you gain as a critical consumer of that is you avoid the seems right trap. So without scientific evidence, we might have believed that Scare Straight works, sounds logical, dramatic, right? A critical consumer looks for research data, not just emotional stories. So what is the data that backs that this was successful, right? We use evidence, not emotion, to guide action. So testimonials create strong pathos, but may not reflect the true effect of the program. Evaluating the actual research keeps decision-making evidence-based. Recognizing the importance of research design. Properly designed studies use control groups, random assignment, and follow-up data to reveal whether an intervention actually helps or harms. You guys, it should be a review of Psych 101. You guys should know what control groups, random assignment, and follow-up data is. If not, we're going to review that later on. Without those methods, we are risk wasting resources or doing harm if we're not evaluating everything that goes into it, right? If we just go off of emotion. And then finally, protecting communities and individuals. If policymakers or parents rely only on the appeal of the program, like Scared Straight, they might support something that increases crime. Being a critical consumer helps ensure resources go to programs that actually work. And then finally, developing healthy skepticism. You learn to ask, what is the source of this claim? Was it tested significantly or scientifically, I should say? Could there be a better alternative to the Scared Straight program? So how scientists work, right? So psychological scientists are identified not by advanced degrees or white lab coats, but by what they do, what they value, and how they think. So we know scientists are empiricists. Scientists test theories, and they use the theory data cycle to do that, which we're going to take a look at shortly. Scientists work in a community. Scientists tackle applied and basic problems. Scientists make their work public, and scientists talk to the world from journal to journalism. So you'll see that there's inquisitive down at the bottom. Please make sure, I want to remind you guys that you do your inquisitive work for this module, as well as use it to study information about this week's concepts, because a lot of the questions that you see on inquisitive are very similar to the types of questions that you're going to see on your guys' midterm and final exam. So we know scientists are empiricists, right? AKA they use the empirical method or empirical research. So they use evidence from the senses, right? Sight, hearing, touch, or from instruments that use the senses, like timers that you can hear, thermometers, right? For touch, photographs as the basis for their conclusions. So empirical evidence can be collected using two different types of methods. So we have quantitative methods and we have qualitative methods. So quantitative methods turn empirical observations into numbers. Think quantity, number of something, right? Use statistics to estimate how strongly related certain variables are. So Quantitative is quantity, numbers, right? Qualitative methods create rich descriptions not simplified into numbers. So quantitative is the numbers. Qualitative is more of your evidence, captures complexity through interviews, focus groups, or participant observations, right? So reflexivity is scientists self-consciously consider how their background or privilege shapes what questions they ask and what interpretations they make, right? So you have to look at that. How does your background shape? Is there bias possibly to questions that you may be asking? So scientists test their theories, and they test their theories with the theory data cycle. Okay. So here we have a picture of a monkey. And in the picture, there's a what they call a wire mom and a cloth mom. So the monkey is holding on to what they call the cloth mom, and the wire the wire mom is on the other side. So in this theory, we are testing the mother-infant attachment theory. That's what we're looking at. So mother-infant attachment, how does that happen? So originally there were two ways that were brought up about how that took place. You had the cupboard theory, and then you had the contact comfort theory. So the cupboard theory is in your guys' textbook, and it talks about how a mother is valuable to a baby mammal because she is a source of food. The baby animal gets hungry, eats food from the mother by nursing, and experiences a pleasant feeling, which is the reduced hunger. Over time, the sight of the mother equals a positive value. So the mother is the cupboard from which the food comes, right? So if you've ever assumed your dog loves you only because you feed it, your beliefs are consistent with the cupboard theory, okay? The other type of theory that goes with mother-infant attachment is what we call contact comfort, which was a theory that was developed by a scientist named Harry Harlow back in 1958. And he did some research with monkeys. So babies are attached to their mothers because of the comfort of their warm, fuzzy fur. That's what he believed, okay? So which theory is right then? In the natural world, a mother provides both food and contact comfort at once. So when the baby clings to her, it is impossible to tell why, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at Harlow's experiment and how he tested his theory, okay? So the research question for Harlow was, do infants bond with caregivers because they provide food or because they provide comfort? So he did his experiment with rhesus monkeys, and infant monkeys were separated from their biological mothers after birth. Each was given two surrogate mothers. You have the wire mother, which is here, and it had a feeding bottle. There was milk, okay? And then it had the soft cloth mother, but the soft cloth mother had no food, okay? So Harlow observed which mother the infants preferred. So the results were the monkeys spent most time clinging to the soft cloth mother, even though the wire mother provided milk. When frightened, they ran to the cloth mother for comfort, not the food source. So he concluded that emotional security and contact comfort are more important than food in forming attachment, contradicting the belief that attachment is based only on feeding. So just so you guys know, I did include some video footage if you go into your Module 1 overview that shows the actual footage and Harry Harlow talking about his experiment with monkeys. So I think it's pretty interesting. You guys can check that out. It's like a 5-minute video. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different parts of the let's go ahead and take a look at the different parts of the theory data cycle. So you'll notice that the theory data cycle goes from top to bottom. I've put in some things for you to help define what each of these are so that you can get a better understanding. But it starts off with a theory, okay? A theory is a statement that describes general principles about how variables relate to one or another, right? Then it moves down to your research question, which leads to an appropriate hypothesis, right? So the research design is put together to test a specific hypothesis. And a hypothesis is just a prediction. You're predicting about the outcomes of your research based on a theory, okay? Going down, the hypothesis is ideally pre-registered before they collect and analyze. Pre-registered is a term referring to a study in which before collecting any data, The research has stated publicly what the study's outcome is expected to be. And then finally, the data. The data then you collect, you test your hypothesis, right? Whatever you pre-registered, is it the same? Which feedback cycle did you get into? Did you find data that supports and strengthens your theory? Or did you find data that is non-supporting and it leads to revising your theory and starting over or improving your research design? So that's how the theory data cycle works. Okay. So for Harlow's theory, it was that contact comfort, not food, was the primary basis for a baby's attachment to its mother, right? Harlow's hypothesis was babies would spend more time on the cozy mother than on the wire mother. When Harlow collected his data, the data that he collected was the amount of time monkeys stayed on each mother. And come to find out, when he concluded his study, the data showed it supported his theory, right? That attachment and the hypothesis was that they would spend more time on the cozy wire mother. So I did include a slide here that goes over the theory data cycle as well, once again for Harlow's monkeys, as well as back to your Scared Straight program, okay? So there are things that come up when people use scientific method and they're testing for things. You have replication. So once a study's done, you want to be able to replicate that study in exactly the same way as somebody else in the future, and hopefully you get the same answers. So the study is conducted again to test whether the results are consistent. That's replication. Weight of evidence is the collection of studies, including replications of the same theory. So for Harlow, in order for him to come up with the conclusion that he came up with, his theory was strongly supported by dozens of individual studies that were tested the theory's limits. Okay, and that's how he came up with his overall conclusion that yes, it is contact comfort. The wire mother was not the one that the monkey spent the most time on. It was actually the soft cloth mother. Okay, so sometimes a hypothesis can happen where you come up with this educated guess about something, and then, hey, you know what? It's not supported. The data is inconsistent with your theory. Sometimes that happens. So you have to troubleshoot the study instead of rejecting the theory. Maybe you got to go back and tweak the research design that you were using. Okay. So you can take a look more at this slide if you want. I believe this is also in your guys' textbook. Your norms for Merton's scientific norms is universalism, communality, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. So each of those is defined on the chart. This is also in your guys' textbook. So universalism is the scientific claims are evaluated according to their merit, independent of the researcher's credentials or reputation. Communality, that's a tongue twister, is the scientific knowledge is created by a community, right? Communality, okay? And its findings belong to the community, okay? Disinterestedness is scientists strive to discover the truth, whatever it is. They are not swayed by conviction, idealism, politics, or profit. When you're on a mission and your mission is to get to whatever it is that you're trying to discover the truth on, you do not let other things get in the way of that, right? And finally, organized skepticism. All scientists are skeptic because you're looking for data and evidence to prove what it is that your theory or hypothesis is, right? So scientists question everything, including their own theories, widely accepted ideas, and ancient wisdom. Okay. So you do need to know the difference between applied research and basic research. That is also test questions for you guys. So applied research is conducted to solve practical problems. The findings will be directly applied to finding a solution to a real world problem, right? So conducting a study to determine if a new method of teaching language arts is working better than the former one. Basic research, its goal is to enhance the general body of knowledge about a particular topic. So example, conducting a study to investigate the limitations of infant attachment. Okay. So scientists make their work public. They use it by submitting their work to a scientific journal. So scientific journals normally come out monthly and they contain articles written by various researchers. So all the articles are what we call peer reviewed. So what does peer reviewed mean? Peer-reviewed means it is reviewed by your peers, meaning 3 or 4 other experts in the field of whatever it is that you're doing your study on. So your paper is sent out by the editor of the journal to these 3 or 4 experts on the subject. And then they tell the editor, based off of them reading your paper, what its virtues and flaws are. And the editor then considers the reviews and decides whether the paper deserves to be published in the journal. So when the peer review process works, research with major flaws does not get published. But some journals reject more than 90% of submissions after peer review. So scientists talk to the world from journal to journalism. And there's a cartoon there that if you look at it and you read through it, it starts off with your research saying one thing, and then it gets transferred to the university, and then a news organization gets a hold of it, and then the internet gets a hold of it, and then cable TV gets a hold of it. And before you know it, by the time it reaches back to you, it's completely different than what you said, kind of like a game of telephone, right? So scientific journals are read by scientists and students, not by the general public, right? So journalism coverage then takes what the scientific journal has written and kind of switches it, changes it up, makes it simplified so that the general public could read it. So journalism is a secondhand report about the research written as a press release done by, let's say, the scientist's university. And then the journalism turns the research into a news story by summarizing it for a popular audience, adding interesting headlines, using non-technical terms, basically making the info more accessible for the public. So sometimes what happens is journalists may overstate the research or get the details wrong. All right, so there is a checking for understanding problem here, a little scenario if you guys want to take a look at it within the slides, because I've included them in the Module 1 overview. And then there are a couple questions there as well. The answers are also included on that slide if you look at it, if you want to test yourself. So I do want to remind you guys that you do have a discussion question, which is applying the theory data cycle in everyday life. So we looked at the theory data cycle, how that takes place from theory to hypothesis, pre-registration, all the way down to data. So you're going to basically apply that to everyday life. So think about a time in your everyday life when you used a version of the theory data cycle to solve a problem or figure something out, okay? And then I do want to also remind you guys have an assignment that's due. So the assignment you're going to be doing is the data says, don't hug your dog. So you guys are going to go through, you're going to read this article about the data says, don't hug a dog. And so the application overview is what you're going to be doing. There are a series of questions that are attached to this. You're going to open up a Google Doc, answer those questions by using information about the theory data cycle. Seeking falsifiable claims, and then the weight of evidence. Okay, so please make sure that you get that done as well. Your assignments are due by Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. Okay, so other than that, that concludes our lecture for this week. Dive right into the information, and I hope you guys have fun learning this chapter.